But there was no recent picture, none which suggested the Robert who had gone away 5 days ago, leaving a void and wilderness behind him. Oh, Robert stopped having his pictures taken when he had to pay for them himself. He found wiser use for his money, he says, explained. She had a letter from him, written before he left New Orleans. Edna wished to see the letter, and Madame Lebrun told her to look for it either on the table or the dresser, or perhaps it was on a mantelpiece. The letter was on the bookshelf. It possessed the greatest interest and attraction for Edna. The envelope, its size and shape, the postmark, the handwriting. She examined every detail of the outside before opening it. There were only a few lines setting forth that he would leave the city that afternoon, that he had packed his trunk in good shape, that he was well and sent her his love, and begged to be affectionately remembered to all. There was no special message to Edna except a postscript, saying that if Mrs. Pontellier desired to finish the book, which he had been reading to her, his mother would find it in his room, among other books there on the table. Edmund experienced a pang of jealousy, because he had written to his mother rather than to her. Everyone seemed to take for granted that she missed him. Even her husband, when he came down the Saturday following Robert's departure, expressed regret that he had gone. "How do you get on without him, Edna?" they asked. "It's very dull without him," she admitted. Mr. Pontellier had seen Robert in the city, and Edna asked him a dozen questions or more. Where had they met? On Carondelet Street in the morning. They had gone in and had a drink and cigar together. What had they talked about? Chiefly about his prospects in Mexico, which Mr. Pontellier thought were promising. How did he look? How did he seem, grave or gay, or how? Quite cheerful, and wholly taken up with the idea of his trip, which Mr. Pontellier found altogether natural in a young fellow about to seek fortune and adventure in a strange, queer country. Edna tapped her foot impatiently and wondered why the children persisted in playing in the sun when they might be under the trees. She went down and led them out of the sun, scolding the quadroon for not being more attentive. It did not strike her as in the least grotesque that she should be making of Robert the object of conversation, and leading her husband to speak of him. The sentiment which she entertained for Robert in no way resembled that which she felt for her husband, or had ever felt or ever expected to feel. She had all her life long been accustomed to harbor thoughts and emotions which never voiced themselves. They had never taken the form of struggles. They belonged to her and were her own, and she entertained the conviction that she had a right to them, and that they concerned no one but herself. Edna had once told Madame Raquinot that she would never sacrifice herself for her children, or for anyone. Then had followed a rather heated argument. The two women did not appear to understand each other, or to be talking the same language. Edna tried to appease her friend, to explain, "I would give up the unessential. I would give my money. I would give my life for my children, but I wouldn't give myself. I can't make it more clear. It's only something which I am beginning to comprehend, which is revealing itself to me. I don't know what you would call the essential or what you mean by the unessential, said Madame Matignon cheerfully. But a woman who would give her life for her children could do no more than that. Your Bible tells you so. I'm sure I couldn't do more than that. Oh, yes, you could, laughed Edna. She was not surprised at Mademoiselle Reisz's question. The morning that lady, following her to the beach, tapped her on the shoulder and asked if she did not greatly miss her young friend. Oh, good morning, mademoiselle. Is it you? Why, of course I miss Robert. Are you going down to bathe? Why should I go down to bathe at the very end of the season, when I haven't been in the surf all summer? Replied the woman, disagreeably. I beg your pardon, offered Edna, in some embarrassment, for she should have remembered that Mademoiselle Reisz's avoidance of the water had furnished a theme for much pleasantry. Some among them thought it was on account of her false hair, or the dread of getting the violets wet, while others attributed it to the natural aversion for water sometimes believed to accompany the artistic temperament. Mademoiselle offered Edna some chocolates in a paper bag, which she took from her pocket by way of showing that she bore no ill feeling. She habitually ate chocolates for their sustaining quality. They contained much nutriment in small compass, she said. They saved her from starvation, as Madame Lebrun's table was utterly impossible, and no one save so impertinent a woman as Madame Lebrun could think of offering such food to people and requiring them to pay for it. She must feel very lonely without her son, said Edna, desiring to change the subject. Her favorite son, too. It must have been quite hard to let him go. Mademoiselle laughed maliciously. Her favorite son. Oh, dear. Who could have been imposing such a tale upon you? Aline Lebrun lives for Victor, and for Victor alone. She has spoiled him into the worthless creature he is. She worships him and the ground he walks on. Robert is very well, in a way, to give up all the money he can earn to the family and keep the barest pittance for himself. Favorite son, indeed. I miss the poor fellow myself, my dear. I like to see him and to hear him about the place. The only Lebrun who is worth a pinch of salt. He comes to see me often in the city. I like to play to him. That Victor hanging would be too good for him. It's a wonder Robert hasn't beaten him to death long ago. I thought he had great patience with his brother, offered Edna, glad to be talking about Robert, no matter what was said. Oh, he thrashed him well enough a year or two ago, said Mademoiselle. It was about a Spanish girl, who Victor considered that he had some sort of claim upon. He met Robert one day talking to the girl, or walking with her, or baiting with her, or carrying her basket. I don't remember what, and he became so insulting and abusive that Robert gave him a thrashing on the spot that has kept him comparatively in order for a good while. It's about time he was getting another. Bound. Was her name Mariakita? Asked Edna. Mariakita. Yes, that was it, Mariakita. I had forgotten. Oh, she's a sly one and a bad one, that Mariakita. Edna looked down at Mademoiselle Reisz and wondered how she could have listened to her venom so long. For some reason, she felt depressed, almost unhappy. She had not intended to go into the water, but she donned her bathing suit and left Mademoiselle alone, seated under the shade of the children's tent. The water was growing cooler as the season advanced. Edna plunged and swam about with an abandon that thrilled and invigorated her. She remained a long time in the water, half hoping that Mademoiselle Reisz would not wait for her. But Mademoiselle waited. She was very amiable during the walk back and raved much over Edna's appearance in her bathing suit. She talked about music. She hoped that Edna would go to see her in the city and wrote her address with the stub of a pencil on a piece of card, which she found in her pocket. When do you leave? Asked Edna. Next Monday. And you? The following week, answered Edna, adding, It has been a pleasant summer, hasn't it, mademoiselle? Well, agreed, Mademoiselle Reisz, with a shrug, rather pleasant, if it hadn't been for the mosquitoes and the Feeble twins. Chapter 17. The Pontelliers possessed a very charming home on Esplanade Street in New Orleans. It was a large double cottage with a broad front veranda whose round fluted columns supported the sloping roof. The house was painted a dazzling white. The outside shutters, or jalousies, were green. In the yard, which was kept scrupulously neat, were flowers and plants of every description which flourishes in South Louisiana. Within doors, the appointments were perfect after the conventional type. The softest carpets and rugs covered the floors. Rich and tasteful draperies hung at doors and windows. There were paintings, selected with judgment and discrimination, upon the walls. The cut glass, the silver, the heavy damask which daily appeared upon the table were the envy of many women whose husbands were less generous than Mr. Pontellier. Mr. Pontellier was very fond of walking about his house, examining its various appointments and details, to see that nothing was amiss. He greatly valued his possessions, chiefly because they were his, and derived a genuine pleasure from contemplating a painting, a statuette, a rare lace curtain, no matter what, after he had bought it and placed it among his household gods. On Tuesday afternoons, Tuesday being Mrs. Pontellier's reception day, there was a constant stream of callers' women who came in carriages, or in the streetcars, or walked when the air was soft and distance permitted. A light-colored mulatto boy, in dress coat and bearing a diminutive silver tray for the reception of cards, admitted them. A maid, in white fluted cap, or for the callers liqueur, coffee, or chocolate, as they might desire. Mrs. Pontellier, attired in a handsome reception gown, remained in the drawing-room the entire afternoon, receiving her visitors. Men sometimes called in the evening, with their wives. This had been the program which Mrs. Pontellier had religiously followed since her marriage, 6 years before. Certain evenings during the week, she and her husband attended the opera, or sometimes the play. Mr. Pontellier left his home in the mornings between 9 and 10 o'clock and rarely returned before 6:30 or 7 in the evening, dinner being served at 7:30. He and his wife seated themselves at table one Tuesday evening, a few weeks after their return from Grand Isle. They were alone together. The boys were being put to bed. The patter of their bare, escaping feet could be heard occasionally, as well as the pursuing voice of the quadroon, lifted in mild protest and entreaty. Mrs. Pontellier did not wear her usual Tuesday reception gown. She was in ordinary house dress. Mr. Pontellier, who was observant about such things, noticed it as he served the soup and handed it to the boy in waiting. Tired out, Edna? Whom did you have? Many callers? He asked. He tasted his soup and began to season it with pepper, salt, vinegar, mustard, everything within reach. There were a good many, replied Edna, who was eating her soup with evident satisfaction. I found their cards when I got home. I was out, exclaimed her husband, with something like genuine consternation in his voice, as he laid down the vinegar cruet and looked at her through his glasses. Why? What could have taken you out on Tuesday? What did you have to do? Nothing. I simply felt like going out, and I went out. Well, I hope you left some suitable excuse, said her husband, somewhat appeased, as he added a dash of cayenne pepper to the soup. No, I left no excuse. I told Joe to say I was out, that was all. Why, my dear, I should think you'd understand by this time that people don't do such things. We've got to observe lay convenances if we ever expect to get on and keep up with the procession. If you felt that you had to leave home this afternoon, you should have left some suitable explanation for your absence. This soup is really impossible. It streams that woman hasn't learned yet to make a decent soup. Any free lunch stand in town serves a better one. Was Mrs. Belthrop here? Bring the tray with the cards, Joe. I don't remember who was here. The boy retired and returned after a moment, bringing the tiny silver tray, which was covered with ladies' visiting cards. He handed it to Mrs. Pontellier. Give it to Mr. Pontellier, she said. Joe offered the tray to Mr. Pontellier and removed the soup. Mr. Pontellier scanned the names of his wife's callers, reading some of them aloud, with comments as he read. The Mrs. Delcedas. I worked a big deal in futures for their father this morning. Nice pearls. It's time they were getting married. Mrs. Belthrop. Tell you what it is, Edna. We can't afford to snap Mrs. Belthrop. Why? Belthrop could buy and sell us 10 times over. His business is worth a good round sum to me. You'd better write her a note. James Highcamp.
You?
The less you have to do with Mrs. Highcamp, the better. Madame Laforce came all the way from Carrollton to poor old soul. Miss Wiggs, this is Eleanor Bolton's. He pushed the cards aside. Mercy, exclaimed Edna, who had been fuming. Why are you taking the thing so seriously and making such a fuss over it? I'm not making any fuss over it. But it's just such seeming trifles that we've got to take seriously. Such things count. The fish was scorched. Mr. Pontellier would not touch it. Edna said she did not mind a little scorched taste. The roast was in some way not to his fancy, and he did not like the manner in which the vegetables were served. It seems to me, he said, we spend money enough in this house to procure at least one meal a day which a man could eat and retain his self-respect. You used to think the cook was a treasure, returned Edna indifferently. Perhaps she was when she first came, but cooks are only human. They need looking after, like any other class of persons that you employ. Suppose I didn't look after the clerks in my office. Just let them run things their own way? They'd soon make a nice mess of me and my business. Where are you going? Asked Edna, seeing that her husband arose from table without having eaten a morsel, except a taste of the highly seasoned soup. I'm going to get my dinner at the club. Good night. He went into the hall, took his hat and stick from the stand, and left the house. She was somewhat familiar with such scenes. They had often made her very unhappy. On a few previous occasions, she had been completely deprived of any desire to finish her dinner. Sometimes she had gone into the kitchen to administer a tardy rebuke to the cook. Once she went to her room and studied the cookbook during an entire evening, finally writing out a menu for the week, which left her harassed with the feeling that, after all, she had accomplished no good that was worth the name. But that evening Edna finished her dinner alone, with forced deliberation. Her face was flushed, and her eyes flamed with some inward fire that lighted them. After finishing her dinner, she went to her room, having instructed the boy to tell any other callers that she was indisposed. It was a large, beautiful room, rich and picturesque, in the soft, dim light, which the maid had turned low. She went and stood at an open window and looked out upon the deep tangle of the garden below. All the mystery and witchery of the night seemed to have gathered there amid the perfumes and the dusky and tortuous outlines of flowers and foliage. She was seeking herself and finding herself in just such sweet half-darkness which met her moods. But the voices were not soothing that came to her from the darkness and the sky above and the stars. They jeered and sounded mournful notes without promise. Devoid even of hope, she turned back into the room and began to walk to and fro down its whole length without stopping, without resting. She carried in her hands a thin handkerchief, which she tore into ribbons, rolled into a ball, and flung from her. Once she stopped, and taking off her wedding ring, flung it upon the carpet. When she saw it lying there, she stamped her heel upon it, striving to crush it. But her small boot heel did not make an indenture, not a mark upon the little glittering circlet. In a swooping passion, she seized a glass vase from the table and flung it upon the tiles of the hearth. She wanted to destroy something. The crash and clatter were what she wanted to hear. A maid, alarmed at the din of breaking glass, entered the room to discover what was the matter. A vase fell upon the hearth, said Edna. Never mind. Leave it till morning. Oh, you might get some of the grass in your feet, ma'am, insisted the young woman, picking up bits of the broken vase that were scattered upon the carpet. And here's your ring, ma'am. Under the chair. Edna held out her hand and, taking the ring, slipped it upon her finger. Chapter 18. The following morning, Mr. Pontellier, upon leaving for his office, asked Edna if she would not meet him in town in order to look at some new fixtures for the library. I hardly think we need new fixtures, Léonce. Don't let us get anything new. You're too extravagant. I don't believe you ever think of saving or putting by. The way to become rich is to make money, my dear Edna, not to save it, he said. He regretted that she did not feel inclined to go with him and select new fixtures. He kissed her good-bye and told her she was not looking well and must take care of herself. She was unusually pale and very quiet. She stood on the front veranda as he quitted the house and absently picked a few sprays of jessamine that grew upon a trellis nearby. She inhaled the odor of the blossoms and thrust them into the bosom of her white morning gown. The boys were dragging along the banquette a small express wagon, which they had filled with blocks and sticks. The quadroon was following them with little quick steps, having assumed a fictitious animation and alacrity for the occasion. A fruit vendor was crying his wares in the street. Edna looked straight before her with a self-absorbed expression upon her face. She felt no interest in anything about her. The street, the children, the fruit vendor, the flowers growing there under her eyes were all part and parcel of an alien world, which had suddenly become antagonistic. She went back into the house. She had thought of speaking to the cook concerning her blunders of the previous night, but Mr. Pontellier had saved her that disagreeable mission for which she was so poorly fitted. Mr. Pontellier's arguments were usually convincing with those whom he employed. He left home feeling quite sure that he and Edna would sit down that evening, and possibly a few subsequent evenings, to a dinner deserving of the name. Edna spent an hour or two in looking over some of her old sketches. She could see their shortcomings and defects, which were glaring in her eyes. She tried to work a little, but found he was not in the humor. Finally, she gathered together a few of the sketches, those which she considered the least discreditable, and she carried them with her when, a little later, she dressed and left the house. She looked handsome and distinguished in her street gown. The tan of the seashore had left her face, and her forehead was smooth, white, and polished beneath her heavy yellow-brown hair. There were a few freckles on her face, and a small, dark mole near the underlip and one on the temple, half hidden in her hair. As Edna walked along the street, she was thinking of Robert. She was still under the spell of her infatuation. She had tried to forget him, realizing the inutility of remembering. But the thought of him was like an obsession, ever pressing itself upon her. But once that wasn't so much about their events, as if she were cleared on urgent readings that had been tired from this time to leave, without being mostly noted about his brothers behind. Edna was on her way to Madame Ratignolle's. Their intimacy, begun at Grand Isle, had not declined, and they had seen each other with some frequency since their return to the city. The Ratignolles lived at no great distance from Edna's home, on the corner of a side street where Monsieur Ratignol owned and conducted a drugstore which enjoyed a steady and prosperous trade. His father had been in the business before him, and Monsieur Ratignol stood well in the community and bore an enviable reputation for integrity and clear-headedness. His family lived in commodious apartments over the store, having an entrance on the side, within the porte cochere. There was something which Edna thought very French, very foreign, about their whole manner of living. In the large and pleasant salon, which extended across the width of the house, the Ratignolles entertained their friends once a fortnight with a soirée musicale, sometimes diversified by card-playing. There was a friend who played upon the cello. One brought his flute, and another his violin, while there were some who sang, and a number who performed upon the piano with various degrees of taste and agility. The Ratignolles' soirées musicales were widely known, and it was considered a privilege to be invited to them. Edna found her friend engaged in assorting the clothes which had returned that morning from the laundry. She at once abandoned her occupation upon seeing Edna, who had been ushered without ceremony into her presence. Sita can do it as well as I. It is really her business, she explained to Edna, who apologized for interrupting her. And she summoned a young black woman, who she instructed, in French, to be very careful in checking off the list which she handed her. She told her to notice particularly if a fine linen handkerchief of Monsieur Ratignolle's, which was missing last week, had been returned, and to be sure to set to one side such pieces as required mending and darning. Then, placing an arm around Edna's waist, she led her to the front of the house, to the salon, where it was cool and sweet, with the odor of great roses that stood upon the hearth in jars. Madame Ratignolle looked more beautiful than ever there at home, in a negligee which left her arms almost wholly bare and exposed the rich, melting curves of her white throat. "Perhaps I shall be able to paint your picture some day," said Edna with a smile when they were seated. She produced the roll of sketches and started to unfold them. "I believe I ought to work again. I feel as if I wanted to be doing something. What do you think of them? Do you think it worthwhile to take it up again and study some more?" I might study for a while with Leopold. She knew that Madame Ratignolle's opinion in such a matter would be next to valueless, that she herself had not alone decided but determined. But she sought the words of praise and encouragement. Your talent is immense, dear. Nonsense, protested Edna, well pleased. Immense, I tell you, persisted Madame Ratignolle, surveying the sketches one by one, at close range, then holding them at arm's length, narrowing her eyes and dropping her head on one side. Surely this Bavarian peasant is worthy of framing, and this basket of apples. And never have I seen anything more lifelike. One might almost be tempted to reach out a hand and take one. Edna could not control a feeling which bordered upon complacency at her friend's praise, even realizing, as she did, its true worth. She retained a few of the sketches and gave all the rest to Madame Ratignolle, who appreciated the gift far beyond its value and proudly exhibited the pictures to her husband when he came up from the store a little later for his midday dinner. Mr. Ratignolle was one of those men who are called the salt of the earth. His cheerfulness was unbounded, and it was matched by his goodness of heart, his broad charity, and common sense. He and his wife spoke English with an accent, which was only discernible through its un-English emphasis and a certain carefulness and deliberation. Edna's husband spoke English with no accent whatever. The Ratignolles understood each other perfectly. If ever the fusion of two human beings into one has been accomplished on this sphere, it was surely in their union. As Edna seated herself at table with them, she thought, better a dinner of herbs, though it did not take her long to discover that it was no dinner of herbs, but a delicious repast, simple, choice, and in every way satisfying. Monsieur Ratignolle was delighted to see her, though he found her looking not so well as at Grand Isle, and he advised a tonic. He talked a good deal on various topics. A little politics, some city news, and neighborhood gossip. He spoke with an animation and earnestness that gave an exaggerated importance to every syllable he uttered. His wife was keenly interested in everything he said, laying down her fork the better to listen, chiming in, taking the words out of his mouth. Edna felt depressed rather than soothed after leaving them. The little glimpse of domestic harmony which had been offered her gave her no regret, no longing. It was not a condition of life which fitted her, and she could see in it, but an appalling and hopeless ennui. She was moved by a kind of commiseration for Madame Ratignolle, a pity for that colorless existence which never uplifted its possessor beyond the region of blind contentment, in which no moment of anguish ever visited her soul, in which she would never have the taste of life's delirium. Edna vaguely wondered what she meant by life's delirium, if it crossed her thought like some unsought, extraneous impression. Chapter 19. Edna could not help but think that it was very foolish, very childish, to have stamped upon her wedding ring and smashed the crystal vase upon the tiles. She was visited by. No more outbursts, moving her to such futile expedients. She began to do as she liked and to feel as she liked. She completely abandoned her Tuesdays at home and did not return the visits of those who had called upon her. She made no ineffectual efforts to conduct her household en bonne ménagère, going and coming as it suited her fancy, and so far as she was able, lending herself to any passing caprice. Mr. Pontellier had been a rather courteous husband, so long as he met a certain tacit submissiveness in his wife. But her new and unexpected line of conduct completely bewildered him. It shocked him. Then her absolute disregard for her duties as a wife angered him. When Mr. Pontellier became rude, Edna grew insolent. No, she had resolved never to take another step backward. It seems to me the utmost folly for a woman at the head of a household and the mother of children to spend in an atelier days which would be better employed contriving for the comfort of her family. I feel like painting, answered Edna. Perhaps I shan't always feel like it. Then, in God's name, paint. But don't let the family go to the devil. There's Madame Latino, because she keeps up her music, she doesn't let everything else go to chaos. And she's more of a musician than you are a painter. She's a musician, and I'm not a painter. It isn't on account of painting that I let things go. On account of what, then? Oh, I don't know. Let me alone. You bother me. It sometimes entered Mr. Pontellier's mind to wonder if his wife were not growing a little unbalanced mentally. He could see plainly that she was not herself. That is, he could not see that she was becoming herself and daily casting aside that fictitious self, which we assume like a garment with which to appear before the world. Her husband let her alone, as she requested, and went away to his office. Edna went up to her atelier, a bright room in the top of the house. She was working with great energy and interest, without accomplishing anything, however, which satisfied her, even in the smallest degree. For a time, she had the whole household enrolled in the service of art. The boys posed for her. They thought it amusing at first, but the occupation soon lost its attractiveness when they discovered that it was not a game arranged especially for their entertainment. The quadroon sat for hours before Edna's palette, patient as a savage, while the housemaid took charge of the children, and the drawing room went undusted. But the housemaid, too, served her term as model when Edna perceived that the young woman's back and shoulders were molded on classic lines, and that her hair, loosened from its confining cap, became an inspiration. While Edna worked, she sometimes sang "Lo the Little Air."
Huh?
Si tu savais. It moved her with recollections. She could hear again the ripple of the water, the flapping sail. She could see the glint of the moon upon the bay, and could feel the soft, gusty beating of the hot south wind. A subtle current of desire passed through her body, weakening her hold upon the brushes and making her eyes burn. There were days when she was very happy without knowing why. She was happy to be alive and breathing, when her whole being seemed to be one with the sunlight, the color, the odors, the luxuriant warmth of some perfect southern day. She liked then to wander alone into strange and unfamiliar places. She discovered many a sunny, sleepy corner, fashioned to dream in. And she found it good to dream and to be alone and unmolested. There were days when she was unhappy. She did not know why, when it did not seem worthwhile to be glad or sorry, to be alive or dead. Life appeared to her like a grotesque pandemonium, and humanity like worms. She could not work on such a day, nor weave fancies to stir her pulses and warm her blood. Chapter 20. It was during such a mood that Edna hunted up Mademoiselle Reisz. She had not forgotten the rather disagreeable impression left upon her by their last interview, but she nevertheless felt a desire to see her, above all, to listen while she played upon the piano. Quite early in the afternoon, she started upon her quest for the pianist. Unfortunately, she had mislaid or lost Mademoiselle Reiz's card, and looking up her address in the city directory, she found that the woman lived on Bienville Street, some distance away. The directory which fell into her hands was a year or more old, however, and upon reaching the number indicated, Edna discovered that the house was occupied by a respectable family of mulattoes who had chambres garnies to let. They had been living there for 6 months and knew absolutely nothing of a Mademoiselle Reisz. In fact, they knew nothing of any of their neighbors. Their lodgers were all people of the highest distinction. They assured Edna she did not linger to the first-class distinctions with Madame Poupon, but hastened to a neighboring grocery store, feeling sure that Mademoiselle would have left her address with the proprietor. He knew Mademoiselle Reisz a good deal better than he wanted to know her. He informed his questioner. In truth, he did not want to know her at all, or anything concerning her. The most disagreeable and unpopular woman who ever lived in Bienville Street. He thanked heaven she had left the neighborhood, and was equally thankful that he did not know where she had gone. Edna's desire to see Mademoiselle Reisz had increased tenfold since these unlooked-for obstacles had arisen to thwart it. She was wondering who could give her the information she sought, when it suddenly occurred to her that Madame Lebrun would be the one most likely to do so. She knew it was useless to ask with Madame Maintenon, who was on the most distant terms with the musician, and preferred to know nothing to send her. She had once been almost as emphatic in expressing herself upon the subject as the corner grocer. Edna knew that Madame Lebrun had returned to the city, for it was the middle of November. And she also knew where the Levans lived, on Chartres Street. Their home from the outside looked like a prison, with iron bars before the door and lower windows. The iron bars were a relic of the old regime, and no one had ever thought of dislodging them. At the side was a high fence enclosing the garden. A gate or door opening upon the street was locked. Edna rang the bell at this side garden gate and stood upon the banquette, waiting to be admitted. It was Victor who opened the gate for her. A black woman, wiping her hands upon her apron, was close at his heels. Before she saw them, Edna could hear them in altercation. The woman, plainly an anomaly, claiming the right to be allowed to perform her duties, one of which was to answer the bell. Victor was surprised and delighted to see Miss Pontellier, and he made no attempt to conceal either his astonishment or his delight. He was a dark-browed, good-looking youngster of 19, greatly resembling his mother, but with 10 times her impetuosity. He instructed the black woman to go at once and informed Madame Lebrun that Mrs. Pontellier desired to see her. The woman grumbled a refusal to do part of her duty when she had not been permitted to do it all, and started back to her interrupted task of weeding the garden. Whereupon Victor administered a rebuke in the form of a volley of abuse, which, owing to its rapidity and incoherence, was all but incomprehensible to Edna. Whatever it was, the rebuke was convincing, for the woman dropped her hoe and went mumbling into the house. Edna did not wish to enter. It was very pleasant there, on the side porch, where there were chairs, a wicker lounge, and a small table. She seated herself, for she was tired from her long tramp, and she began to rock gently and smooth out the folds of her silk parasol. Victor drew up his chair beside her. He at once explained that the black woman's offensive conduct was all due to imperfect training, as he was not there to take her in hand. He had only come up from the island the morning before and expected to return next day. He stayed all winter at the island. He lived there and kept the place in order and got things ready for the summer visitors. But a man needed occasional relaxation. He informed Mrs. Pontellier, and every now and again he drummed up a pretext to bring him to the city. My! But he had had a time of it the evening before. He wouldn't want his mother to know, and he began to talk in a whisper. He was scintillant with recollections. Of course, he couldn't think of telling Mrs. Pontellier all about it, she being a woman and not comprehending such things. But it all began with a girl peeping and smiling at him through the shutters as he passed by. Oh? But she was a beauty. Certainly, he smiled back and went up and talked to her. Mrs. Pontellier did not know him if she supposed he was one to let an opportunity like that escape him. Despite herself, the youngster amused her. She must have betrayed in her look some degree of interest or entertainment. But the boy grew more daring, and Mrs. Pontellier might have found herself, in a little while, listening to a highly colored story, but for the timely appearance of Madame Lebrun. That lady was still clad in white, according to her custom of the summer. Her eyes beamed an effusive welcome. Would not Mrs. Pontellier go inside? Would she partake of some refreshment? Why had she not been there before? How was that, dear Mr. Pontellier? And how were those sweet children? Had Mrs. Pontellier ever known such a warm November? Victor went and reclined on the wicker lounge behind his mother's chair, where he commanded a view of Edna's face. He had taken her parasol from her hands while he spoke to her, and he now lifted it and twirled it above him as he lay on his back. And Madame Lebrun complained that it was so dull coming back to the city, that she saw so few people now, that even Victor, when he came up from the island for a day or two, had so much to occupy him and engage his time. She somehow felt like a confederate in crime and tried to look severe and disapproving. There had been but 2 letters from Robert, with little in them, they told her. Victor said it was really not worthwhile to go inside for the letters, when his mother entreated him to go in search of them. He remembered the contents, which in truth he rattled off very glibly when put to the test. One letter was written from Vera Cruz, and the other from the city of Mexico. He had met Montel, who was doing everything toward his advancement. So far, the financial situation was no improvement over the one he had left in New Orleans. But of course, the prospects were vastly better. He wrote of the city of Mexico, the buildings, the people, and their habits, the conditions of life which he found there. He sent his love to the family. He enclosed a check to his mother and hoped she would affectionately remember him to all his friends. That was about the substance of the 2 letters. Edna felt that if there had been a message for her, she would have received it. The despondent frame of mind in which she had left home began again to overtake her, and she remembered that she wished to find Mademoiselle Rice. Madame Lebrun knew where Mademoiselle Rice lived. She gave Edna the address, regretting that she would not consent to stay and spend the remainder of the afternoon, and pay a visit to Mademoiselle Rice some other day. The afternoon was already well advanced. Victor escorted her out upon the banquette, lifted her parasol, and held it over her while he walked to the car with him. He entreated her to bear in mind that the disclosures of the afternoon were strictly confidential. She laughed and bantered him a little, remembering too late that she should have been dignified and reserved. "How handsome Mrs. Pontellier looked," said Madame Lebrun to her son. "Ravishing," he admitted. "The city atmosphere has improved her. Some way she doesn't seem like the same woman." Chapter 21. Some people contended that the reason Mademoiselle Reisz always chose apartments up under the roof was to discourage the approach of beggars, peddlers, and cullers. There were plenty of windows in her little front room. They were for the most part dingy, but as they were nearly always open, it did not make so much difference. They often admitted into the room a good deal of smoke and soot, but at the same time, all the light and air that there was came through them. From her windows could be seen the crescent of the river, the masts of ships, and the big chimneys of the Mississippi steamers. A magnificent piano crowded the apartment. In the next room she slept, and in the third and last she harbored a gasoline stove on which she cooked her meals when disinclined to descend to the neighboring restaurant. It was there also that she ate, keeping her belongings in a rare old buffet, dingy and battered from 100 years of use. When Edna knocked at Mademoiselle Rice's front room door and entered, she discovered that person standing beside the window. engaged in mending or patching an old Prunauer gaiter. The little musician laughed all over when she saw Edna. Her laugh consisted of a contortion of the face and all the muscles of the body. She seemed strikingly homely, standing there in the afternoon light. She still wore the shabby lace and the artificial bunch of violets on the side of her head. "And so you remembered me at last," said Mademoiselle. I said to myself, bah, she will never come. "Did you want me to come?" asked Edna, with a smile. "I had not thought much about it," answered Mademoiselle. The two had seated themselves on a little bumpy sofa, which stood against the wall. "I am glad, however, that you came. I have the water boiling back there and was just about to make some coffee. You will drink a cup with me. And how is la belle dame?" "Always handsome. Always healthy. Always contented." She took Edna's hand between her strong, wiry fingers, holding it loosely without warmth, and executing a sort of double theme upon the back and palm. "Yes," she went on, "I sometimes thought, she will never come. She promised, as those women in society always do, without meaning it. She will not come."
For I really don't believe you like me, Mrs. Pontellier.
"I don't know whether I like you or not," replied Edna, gazing down at the little woman with a quizzical look. The candor of Mrs. Pontellier's admission greatly pleased Mamillielle Reese. She expressed her gratification by repairing forthwith to the region of the gasoline stove and rewarding her guest with the promised cup of coffee. The coffee and the biscuit accompanying it proved very acceptable to Edna, who has declined refreshment at Madame Lebrun's and was now beginning to feel hungry. Mademoiselle set the tray, which she brought in upon a small table near at hand, and seated herself once again on the lumpy sofa. "I have had a letter from your friend," she remarked, as she poured a little cream into Edna's cup and handed it to her. "My friend?" "Yes, your friend Robert. He wrote to me from the city of Mexico." "Wrote to you?" A mother, repeated Edna in amazement, stirring her coffee absently. "Yes, to me." "Why not? Don't stir all the warmth out of your coffee. Drink it." "But the letter might as well have been sent to you. It was nothing but Mrs. Pontellier from beginning to end." "Let me see it," bequested the young woman, entreatingly. "No, a letter concerns no one but the person who writes it, and the one to whom it is written." "Haven't you just said it concerned me from beginning to end?" "It was written about you, not to you. Have you seen Mrs. Pontellier?" "How is she looking?" he asks. "As Mrs. Pontellier says, or as Mrs. Pontellier once said, if Mrs. Pontellier should call upon you, play for her that impromptu of Chopin's, my favorite. I heard it here a day or two ago, but not as you play it. I should like to know how it affects her, and so on, as if you supposed we were constantly in each other's society." Let me see the letter.
Oh no.
Have you answered it? No. Let me see the letter. No. And again, no. Then play the impromptu for me. It is growing late. What time do you have to be home? Time doesn't concern me. Your question seems a little rude. Play the impromptu. But you have told me nothing of yourself. What are you doing? Painting, laughed Edna. I am becoming an artist. Think of it. Oh, an artist. You have pretensions, madam. Why pretensions? You think I could not become an artist. I do not know you well enough to say. I do not know your talent or your temperament. To be an artist includes much. One must possess many gifts, absolute gifts, which have not been acquired by one's own effort. And moreover, to succeed, the artist must possess the courageous soul. What do you mean by the courageous soul? Courageous underscore ma foi, the brave soul, the soul that dares and defies. Show me the letter and play for me impromptu. You see that I have persistence. Does that quality count for anything in art? It counts with a foolish old woman whom you have captivated, replied Mademoiselle, with her wriggling laugh. The letter was right there at hand in the drawer of the little table, upon which Edna had just placed her coffee cup. Madalox one opened the drawer and drew forth the letter, the topmost one. She placed it in Edna's hands, and without further comment arose and went to the piano. Mademoiselle played a soft interlude. It was an improvisation. She sat low at the instrument, and the lines of her body settled into ungraceful curves and angles that gave it an appearance of deformity. Gradually and imperceptibly, the interlude melted into the soft open minor chords of the Chopin impromptu. Edna did not know when the impromptu began or ended. She sat in the sofa corner, reading Robert's letter by the fading light. Mademoiselle had glided from the Chopin into the quivering love notes of Isolde's song, and back again to the impromptu with its soulful and poignant longing. The shadows deepened in the little room. The music grew strange and fantastic, turbulent, insistent, plaintive, and soft with entreaty. The shadows grew deeper. The music filled the room. It floated out upon the night, over the housetops, the crescent of the river, losing itself in the silence of the upper air. Edna was sobbing, just as she had wept one midnight at Grand Isle when strange new voices awoke in her. She arose in some agitation to take her departure. May I come again, mademoiselle? She asked at the threshold. Come whenever you feel like it. Be careful. The stairs and landings are dark. Don't stumble. Mademoiselle re-entered and lit a candle. Robert's letter was on the floor. She stooped and picked it up. It was crumpled and damp with tears. Mademoiselle smoothed the letter out, restored it to the envelope, and replaced it in the table drawer. Chapter 22. One morning on his way into town, Mr. Pontellier stopped at the house of his old friend and family physician, Dr. Mandelet. The doctor was a semi-retired physician, resting, as the saying is, upon his laurels. He bore a reputation for wisdom rather than skill, leaving the active practice of medicine to his assistants and younger contemporaries, and was much sought for in matters of consultation. A few families, united to him by bonds of friendship, he still attended when they required the services of a physician. The Pontelliers were among these. Mr. Pontellier found the doctor reading at the open window of his study. His house stood rather far back from the street, in the center of a delightful garden, so that it was quiet and peaceful at the old gentleman's study window. He was a great reader. He stared out disapprovingly over his eyeglasses as Mr. Pontellier entered, wondering who had the temerity to disturb him at that hour of the morning.
Ah, Pontellier.
Not sick, I hope. Come and have a seat. What news do you bring this morning? He was quite portly, with a profusion of gray hair and small blue eyes, which age had robbed of much of their brightness, but none of their penetration. Oh, I'm never sick, doctor. You know that I come of tough fiber, of that old Creole race of Pontelliers that dry up and finally blow away. I came to consult. No, not precisely to consult. To talk to you about Edna. I don't know what ails her. Madame Pontellier not well, marveled the doctor. Why, I saw her, I think it was a week ago, walking along Canal Street, the picture of health, it seemed to me. Yes, she seems quite well, said Mr. Pontellier, leaning forward and whirling his stick between his two hands. But she doesn't act well. She's odd. She's not like herself. I can't make her out. And I thought perhaps you'd help me. But how does she act? Inquired the doctor. Well, it isn't easy to explain, said Mr. Pontellier, throwing himself back in his chair. She lets the housekeeping go to the dickens. Well, women are not all alike, my dear Pontellier. We've got to consider, I know that. I told you I couldn't explain. Her whole attitude toward me and everybody and everything has changed. You know, I have a quick temper, but I don't want to quarrel or be rude to a woman, especially my wife, yet I'm driven to it, and feel like 10,000 devils after I've made a fool of myself. She's making it devilishly uncomfortable for me. He went on nervously. She's got some sort of notion in her head concerning the eternal rights of women. And you understand, we meet in the morning at the breakfast table. The old gentleman lifted his shaggy eyebrows, protruded his thick nether lip, and tapped the arms of his chair with his cushioned fingertips. What have you been doing to her, Pontellier? Dilling, Bleu. Has she asked the doctor with a smile? Has she been associating of late with a circle of pseudo-intellectual willy, super-spiritual superior beings? My wife has been telling me about them. That's the trouble, broke in Mr. Pontellier. She hasn't been associating with anyone. She has abandoned her Tuesdays at home, has thrown over all her acquaintances, and goes tramping about by herself, moping in the streetcars, getting in after dark. I tell you, she's peculiar. I don't like it. I feel a little worried over it. This was a new aspect for the doctor. Nothing hereditary. He asked seriously, nothing peculiar about her family antecedents, is there? Oh, no. Indeed. She comes of sound old Presbyterian Kentucky stock. The old gentleman, her father, I have heard, used to atone for his weekday sins with his Sunday devotions. I know for a fact that his racehorses literally ran away with the prettiest bit of Kentucky farming land I ever laid eyes upon. Margaret, you know Margaret? She has all the Presbyterianism undiluted. And the youngest is something of a vixen. By the way, she gets married in a couple weeks from now. Send your wife up to the wedding, exclaimed the doctor, foreseeing a happy solution. Let her stay among her own people for a while. It will do her good. That's what I want her to do. She won't go to the marriage. She says a wedding is one of the most lamentable spectacles on earth. Nice thing for a woman to say to her husband, exclaimed Mr. Pontellier, fuming anew at the recollection. Pontellier, said the doctor, after a moment's reflection, let your wife alone for a while. Don't bother her, and don't let her bother you. Woman, my dear friend, is a very peculiar and delicate organism. A sensitive and highly organized woman, such as I know Mrs. Pontellier to be, is especially peculiar. It would require an inspired psychologist to deal successfully with them. And when ordinary fellows like you and me attempt to cope with their idiosyncrasies, the result is bungling. Most women are moody and whimsical. This is some passing whim of your wife due to some cause or causes which you and I needn't try to fathom. But it will pass happily over, especially if you let her alone. Send her around to see. Oh, I couldn't do that. There'd be no reason for it, objected Mr. Pontellier. Then I'll go around and see her, said the doctor. We'll drop in to dinner some evening en bonhomie. Do, by all means, urged Mr. Pontellier. What evening will you come? Say Thursday. Will you come Thursday? He asked, rising to take his leave. Very well. Thursday. My wife may possibly have some engagement for me Thursday. In case she has, I shall let you know. Otherwise, you may expect me. Mr. Pontellier turned before leaving to say, I am going to New York on business very soon. I have a big scheme on hand and want to be on the field proper to pull the ropes and handle the ribbons. We'll let you in on the inside if you say so. Doctor. He laughed. No. I thank you, my dear sir, returned the doctor. I leave such ventures to you younger men, with the fever of life still in your blood. What I wanted to say, continued Mr. Pontellier, with his hand on the knob, I may have to be absent a good while. Would you advise me to take Edna along? By all means, if she wishes to go. If not, leave her here. Don't contradict her. The mood will pass, I assure you. It may take a month to 3 months, possibly longer, but it will pass. Have patience. Well, goodbye, aujourd'hui, said Mr. Pontellier, as he let himself out. The doctor would have liked, during the course of conversation, to ask, is there any man in the case? But he knew his Creole too well to make such a blunder as that. He did not resume his book immediately, but sat for a while meditatively looking out into the garden. Chapter 23. Edna's father was in the city and had been with them several days. She was not very warmly or deeply attached to him, but they had certain tastes in common, and when together they were companionable. His coming was in the nature of a welcome disturbance. It seemed to furnish a new direction for her emotions. He had come to purchase a wedding gift for his daughter, Janet, and an outfit for himself in which he might make a creditable appearance at her marriage. Mr. Pontellier had selected the bridal gift, as everyone immediately connected with him always deferred to his taste in relationship in such matters. And his suggestions, and on the question of dress, which too often assumes the nature of a problem, were of inestimable value to his father-in-law. But for the past few days, the old gentleman had been upon Edna's hands, and in his society she was becoming acquainted with a new set of sensations. He had been a colonel in the Confederate Army, and still maintained, with the title, the military bearing, which had always accompanied it. His hair and mustache were white and silky, emphasizing the rugged bronze of his phiz. He was tall and thin, and wore his coats padded, which gave a fictitious kind of breadth and depth to his shoulders and chest. Edna and her father looked very distinguished together, and excited a good deal of notice during their perambulations. Upon his arrival, she began by introducing him to her atelier, and making a sketch of him. He took the whole matter very seriously. If her talent had been tenfold greater than it was, it would not have surprised him, convinced as he was that he had bequeathed to all of his daughters the germs of a masterful capability, which only depended upon their own efforts to be directed towards successful achievement. Before her pencil, he sat rigid and unflinching, as he had faced the cannon's mouth in days gone by. He resented the intrusion of the children, who gaped with wondering eyes at him, sitting so stiff up there in their mother's bright atelier. When they drew near, he motioned them away with an expressive action of the foot, loath to disturb the fixed lines of his countenance, his arms, or his rigid shoulders. Edna, anxious to entertain him, invited Mademoiselle Reisz to meet him, having promised him a treat in her piano playing, but Mademoiselle declined the invitation. So together they attended a soirée musicale at the Ragnolus. Monsieur and Madame Ratignolle made much of the colonel, installing him as the guest of honor and engaging him at once to dine with them the following Sunday, or any day which he might select.